Across the wide and lonesome prairie, the Oregon Trail Diary of Hattie Campbell, 1847, by Christiana Gregory. Next day. Wet blankets were hung to dry inside the wagons and outside pinned to the canvas. They soon were so full of trail dust that it was a chore to shake the mud loose. Tall Joe says last night was just a drizzle, nothing compared to the heavy rains he's seen in years past, so we should shut up and count ourselves lucky. When word spread that Gideon and Pepper planned to marry, the women began putting together a wedding chest for them. Aunt June emptied one of her trunks and began folding and packing gifts that folks brought. A beautiful down quilt came from one family. There were bed sheets and linens, a tarp, lantern and Dutch oven, an axe and a kettle. I gave her my tin of Babbitt's powdered soap. One lady brought over her own lace nightgown and petticoat, never worn, that she'd been saving to wear when she got to Oregon. May as well have a bride enjoy 'em now, she said. Oregon's a long way off, and who knows what'll happen between now and then. Pepper and Gideon take long walks in the evening, then appear in time for the last dance. They hold hands until the fire is low. She's late crawling into our bed, and I wake up to her whispering in my ear, "Hattie?" For a while we watch the stars and talk and wonder about the mysteries of marriage. But I worry, will she still be my friend? Will we live next door to each other like we planned? Later. I am ashamed of myself. Today the fat lady came over to visit, but Ma was down by the creek. I was figuring on how to act busy when the lady said, "Hello, honey, I made some taffy for you to share with your brothers. Here you go." She handed me the candy wrapped in oilcloth and smiled at me so kindly I felt ashamed that I had avoided her so. Right quick I invited her to tea, recollecting Aunt June having told me to be hospitable. While the kettle was set over the fire to boil, the lady went to her wagon and came back with her husband riding on her wide shoulders. They introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Big. Cross my heart, I did not laugh at their name. Mrs. Big says she has to drive the wagon on account of her husband being crippled. He sits next to her to keep her company, and now I recall seeing them talk and laugh together hour after hour like old friends. Because he has no legs and the trail is so rough, he ties himself to the bench so he won't bounce off. They said that a few years ago he was trampled by horses from a runaway wagon, and his crushed legs had to be amputated. Poor man, I've decided they're two of the nicest folks I ever did meet, and I will strike anyone who makes fun of them or the fact that her name describes her. I'm so glad I kept my first opinions to myself. If Pepper knew how unkind I can be, I would melt from shame. Later. When Mrs. Big heard that Pepper is to be married, she dug in her trunk and pulled out one of her lace tablecloths. She marched over to our camp, pulling a cart where Mr. Big sits like he's riding in a little train. She held the lace up to Pepper and said, "Honey, I'm going to make you the prettiest wedding dress you'll ever set eyes on." And she did. For 5 evenings, Mrs. Big sewed and cut and measured until she had a creamy white dress with long sleeves and a bow that ties at the waist. Mr. Big sat beside her in his cart sewing too. He made a lacy overskirt from curtains that had hung in their parlor back in Missouri. Finally, we gathered by her wagon and held up blankets to make a private room. Pepper carefully stepped into the dress. As her mother buttoned up the back, the ladies caught their breath. She looked so beautiful. The wedding is planned for when we arrive at Independence Rock a few days away. A hot afternoon. Mrs. Anderson came over this morning as we were packing up our breakfast plates. She looks very thin, but there's more color to her cheeks. I can hardly look at her without wanting to cry for little Cassia. She said to Ma, "It was so warm last night I think I left my shawl by your fire. Have you seen it, Augusta?" Together they looked under the wagon by the crates and stools, then in Aunt June's wagon. I remember it was a pretty blue shawl with fringe. We looked and looked. Wade is feeling good enough to dance, but when the fiddler started up, he asked another girl. I was so upset I ran outside the circle where it was dark. For a long time I sat in the dirt where no one could watch me, watching the dancers. I felt so alone. I want someone to love me the way Gideon loves Pepper. Mid-June. The North Platte River runs west, but now we've come to where it makes a sharp turn to the south. We must cross it in order to continue toward Oregon. Imagine our surprise to see that the Mormons not only had come and gone, but left behind 9 men to build a ferry. 2 ferries, and they would be glad to help us across for just $1.50 per wagon. My, the arguments that broke out because of this. Tall Joe said that over his dead body would he pay 1 penny to cross a river that he saw years before Brigham Young even knew it existed. But Pa said, I think it's mighty enterprising of the Mormons to start a business in such a faraway place. Mr. and Mrs. Kenker cursed something fierce, thinking they might need to part with some of their money. Several families said this: Those Mormons are so high and mighty they stayed on the other side of the river and wouldn't associate with us. But now that they can make $1 off us, they're friendly as can be. Come on, folks, Pa said. Brigham Young's people are trying to start a new life, just like us. And I'll tell you something else. We ain't their judge. God Almighty is. So let's get going and not be so mad about everything. He and Uncle Tim bargained with the Mormons. 2 sacks of cornmeal paid our passage across, on rafts made from thin logs and strips of leather. Each raft, they said, could hold up to 1,800 pounds, but I don't know. It felt unsteady, and water washed over my feet as I helped Ma hold the wagon. I was so scared we'd sink, my knees ached from standing stiff. The littlest children sat safe inside, real still so the wagon wouldn't rock. Pa and Uncle Tim swam with the animals, my little brother Jake on the back of a mule. The water came up to his waist, but his fingers were hooked tight into the harness. I kept an eye on him, ready to dive in if he should slip off. Once our family and the Andersons were all safe across that deep river, I was not so nervous. It took 6 days to get everyone over. Many refused to pay the Mormons and instead forded the river without help. Except for wet belongings and scared children, everything was all right until the last day, when we heard screams. I looked out, and there in the middle of the current was 2 wagons side by side, their mules swimming hard, their big brown heads straining for each breath. Somehow one of the mules drifted downstream into the other team and got its hooves tangled in the harnesses. The poor mule panicked. Then right before our eyes the animals began to drown. They sank so fast they pulled the wagons under water before anyone had a chance to jump out. 2 families disappeared just like that. I'm sick at heart. The screams of their friends on shore I will never forget as long as I live. For 1 day the men searched for bodies while the last of the families came over. Meanwhile everyone stayed busy doing regular things, almost like nothing bad had happened. Pa said the 9 Mormons will take apart their wagons to build a cabin, then stay till more pioneers come out next summer. This gave Pa and Mr. Lewis an idea. Soon enough they had bartered wood to make a small wagon with 3 hoops. They bought a tent and with the help of Mr. and Mrs. Big Sewing turned the canvas into a top. They traded beans for 2 mules with harnesses and neck collars. What on earth? Asked Ma. There stood a miniature prairie schooner about 5 feet long and 3 feet wide with 1 set of wheels. Mr. Lewis grinned when he answered, It's a wedding gift for my daughter and Gideon. Pa made friends with one of the Mormons, a man named Appleton M. Harmon, and they got to talking about something Brigham Young and his men invented on the trail to measure miles. It's called a rotometer. He drew Pa a picture in the sand, and it looks like 4 or 5 wooden cogs attached to the wagon wheel. Somehow it works. The Mormons also have something like a thermometer that measures barometric pressure. This is how they know the altitude. Later. We are camped at Sweetwater River. I watched from shore while my brothers played in the shallows with some other children. The current is slow, but still I worry they'll be swept away. Independence Rock. From a distance, the slope rock looks like a bear sleeping on its side. Up close, it's huge and easy to climb. Folks have been going up to the top to see the view and carve their names. Some boys raced each other up, then fired pistols in the air to celebrate. Jake asked Pa if he could have a few sticks of dynamite to throw off the top just to see what would happen. Pa thought a moment. When he said yes, Jake let out a happy yell. Pepper and I were at the river when we heard the explosion. We turned in time to see a puff of smoke floating down from the top. Some cattle took off running in fright, but were rounded up quick by men on horseback. I don't understand why boys like such things or why Pa thinks dynamite is safer than rifles. The wedding was late afternoon in the cool shadow of Independence Rock. Pepper was beautiful. She was barefoot with a wreath of wildflowers in her hair, and her dress seemed to float with the breeze. Gideon was so shy that when someone yelled, "Kiss the bride!" he blushed redder than a sunburn and just kept holding her hand. Soon enough there was music and dancing and food, plenty of it. Wade came up to me smiling, but instead of asking me to dance, he said, "Hattie, want to play a trick on my sister?" He led me to their new wagon. Mrs. Lewis and the ladies had made up a cozy bed with curtains for privacy, and there was a lantern hanging from one of the hoops inside. Wade opened a sack that he had brung over earlier and began pulling out pots, pins, and other trinkets, which he tied with string under the wagon. I brushed on my apron, nervous. Darkness had fallen. Soon we saw Gideon holding Pepper's hand and leading her away from the campfire. Wade and I ran into the shadows. When the newlyweds climbed into their wagon, Wade whispered, "Get ready, Hattie." He gave a little whistle, and to my surprise, out of the darkness appeared dozens of men and women, some children, too. All waited for about 5 minutes, real quiet. Finally, Wade whistled softly. 2 men hurried to the front of the wagon, lifted the tongue, and began running as if they was mules. Noise erupted from the pans clanging underneath. The crowd that had gathered ran alongside, whooping and yelling and banging spoons, making the wildest noise I had ever heard. We followed the wagon until the men halted at the edge of the prairie about a mile from camp. The noise stopped. For a moment we heard the perfect quiet of night, crickets and wind sighing through the grass. Then Wade began singing a hymn in a beautiful, slow voice. "May our good Lord watch over you always." After the first verse, everyone joined in, then slowly began walking back to camp, where there was still music. Wade caught up to me. In the firelight I could see his green eyes, and he was smiling. "That shivaree was some fun, wasn't it, Hattie?" Now I was the one to feel shy. Before I could think of something to say, he took my hand and led me past the fiddler to join the other dancers. Another day. About the Sweetwater River. Tall Joe says it got its name from some trappers who tried to get their mules across during a storm. One of the packs was full of sugar, and when its saddle broke, in went 300 pounds of sugar. Rocks on either side rise up about 400 feet, forming a narrow river canyon called Devil's Gate. The trail drops into nothing, so the wagons had to drive on the outside about half a mile away. It took all day. Some of us climbed to the top of the cliff for a view. It was spectacular, but it made my stomach turn to look over the ledge. The river was so far down. Tall Joe told us that a few years ago a young bride fell to her death doing what we'd just done. Another day. My little brother Ben fell off the wagon seat just before noon as we were pulling to a stop. The wheels rolled over his left arm so that it hung like a broken stick. He cried and cried while Pa set it in a splint. I ran among the families to look for brandy or rum or something to help his pain. I knocked at the Kankers' wagon and leaned in. Mrs. Kanker sat on a quilt knitting, her husband asleep beside her. When I told her about Benny, she said, "Oh, my word, how terribly dreadful," and set down her needles. She uncorked a jug and poured whiskey into a tin cup about 2 inches deep. "Give this to your brother, dear, and he'll not feel a thing." I thanked her and hurried back to Ma, trying not to spill the whiskey. Soon Benny was quiet, and as Pa rocked him to sleep I remembered Mrs. Kanker's knitting. Her yarn was the same color blue as Mrs. Anderson's shawl that disappeared. I'm sure we have a thief among us and worried that I'm the only one who knows. I don't want to bother Pepper about it, and Aunt June is so tired. Ma probably won't believe me on account she says we must always respect our elders no matter what. Grandmothers don't steal is probably what she'd say. My cheeks and the back of my hands are peeling from sunburn. I rub in axle grease, but the dust sticks to my skin. It is tiresome to feel dirty all the time. Later. 6 oxen died yesterday, and 1 mule. After butchering them where they fell, we kept going. They're too heavy to move, and there ain't time to bury them. Tall Joe made an announcement at supper. "We must lighten our loads to make it easier on the tired animals." Ma said to me, "That dresser and rocker can go, but I will never part with your sister's things." When we pulled out this morning, there was an odd assortment left in camp. A wash tub, an oval mirror, 2 trunks filled with brand new shoes, a piano, and a bird cage. Someone had put several dozen books onto the shelves of a china hutch, neat and tidy as a library. Maybe folks coming behind will get to enjoy them, but who has time to read? Tall Joe caught Mrs. Kanker picking through the items and said, "Madam, if your oxen drop dead from all the junk you're making them pull, why, I ain't waiting for you or that husband of yours to find a new team." The trail seems to be uphill. Today it was our turn to be in front, and I thought at last we'll have no dust. But the wind was at our backs, so we walked in blowing dirt all day long. My skirt pressed behind my legs, often tripping me. Jake and I took turns riding in the wagon to help Ma. I don't like it one bit because it's so hot inside, stuffy and cramped, but we must keep Ben still so his arm will heal. Pa said it was a blessing the bone didn't poke through his skin, else they might have had to amputate on account of infection. Poor Benny, he wants to play and run alongside the oxen, but Ma's too scared. A boy in one of the other wagons, we don't know the family, was riding on their sideboard. No one knows what happened, but somehow he fell and was trampled by the mules behind. There was so much dust that it wasn't until 3 wagons passed did they find him. We all stopped for an hour. They buried him in the middle of the road so wolves won't dig him up. We could hear the boy's mother and sisters wailing, even above the noise of our moving wagons. Along the Sweetwater. Today when I saw Pepper in Gideon's little wagon, she waved me over. "Please walk with me, Hattie," she called. I was so happy to be with her again. As Gideon drives and she walks alongside, they keep smiling at each other. She's more talkative than ever, which makes me feel good. I think she's glad we're friends. The next miles of trails twisted through ravines and sandy slopes. We were nervous to see rattlesnakes everywhere, draped over rocks and coiled in the hot sun. Pa said the West is home to these snakes, so we might just learn to be careful is all. Way ahead in the distance we can see dust from the Mormons. They're at least 1 day away. Mosquitoes are terrible, and now they're also biting flies. My arms are covered with welts that bleed because I can't help scratching. My sleeves have blood stains such that I want to rip away the cloth, they look so soiled. I wish I had many, many clean dresses instead of this old ragged thing. I yearn to feel pretty again. Funny, but now I do wear my bonnet, and Pepper wears hers. I tease her about being an old married lady, but the truth is our faces hurt from sunburn, and the skin keeps peeling. The ridge of my nose is so raw it stings. Every night I rub axle grease on it, and my lips too, not hardly minding the stink of it any more. There was another wedding last evening. The bride is also 14, and her new husband about 30 years old. He's a carpenter, the one whose wife died a few weeks ago before we reached Chimney Rock. So now this girl's a mother of 3 young sons and a newborn daughter. Some older women are helping her care for the baby, and one is nursing it every few hours. I feel sorry for the girl, all at once having to learn how to be a wife and a mother of 4 children. But Ma says things will probably turn out all right because the bride and groom need each other. He was a widower, and she was an orphan traveling with an elderly cousin. They'll grow to love one another, Hattie. South Pass. Tall Joe says we've come near 900 miles. That means we're almost halfway to Oregon. There are cheers and singing and gunshots. Pa thought crossing the Continental Divide would be treacherous, but the gap here is 12 miles wide and as gentle as a cornfield. The slope is so gradual we hardly knew where we were. To the north are the Wind River Mountains covered with snow. There is a carpety yellow and blue wildflowers spread between boulders and pine trees, so beautiful. It's sunny, but the air is thin and cold because of the elevation, about 8,000 feet. Women and girls are picking bouquets to hang upside down in our wagons so they'll keep their color while drying. This way we'll have flowers during our winter in Oregon. Tall Joe says the nights are so cold at South Pass we must keep going down the western slope to a campground called Pacific Creek. End of June, Pacific Creek. We're camped here for 2 days to rest and celebrate. It's a wondrous feeling to think we are finally in the West. Now the rivers and streams flow to the Pacific Ocean instead of eastward toward the Atlantic. Everyone who was able dipped a cup in the water and held it up for a cheer. The fiddlers got busy, and soon everyone was ready to dance. Everyone except Mama. She said not until her feet are in Oregon City will she celebrate. Some moments Mama is so grouchy I know for certain I mustn't upset her with news about our thief. For part of the day we shared a campsite with the Mormons. Pepper, Gideon, Wade, and I walked over to their wagons curious. There was a fire where a spit held a roasting side of beef. We saw 3 women busy carrying plates back and forth, but didn't see any children. I wondered which one was Brigham Young's wife. A colored man came over and introduced himself by the odd name of Green Flake, then asked us to please leave on account of his people resting. Someone said he once was a slave, but now is Brigham Young's personal assistant.